Friedrich Nietzsche was not just a philosopher, he was a force of nature. A mind so radical that his ideas reshaped philosophy, psychology, and even modern culture. He questioned everything: morality, religion, the foundations of human existence. And yet, behind this brilliance there was a man consumed by his own ideas. Nietzsche famously declared, "God is dead." But what happens when you kill God? What happens when you strip away every comforting illusion that humanity has clung to for centuries? He believed he had uncovered the truth, but that truth nearly destroyed him. His ideas would later influence thinkers like Sigmund Freud, who saw Nietzsche's insights as foundational for understanding the human psyche. His vision of the world would shape the existentialist movement, inspiring figures like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus, who wrestled with the consequences of a world without inherent meaning. Even Carl Jung, one of the greatest minds in psychology, grappled with Nietzsche's warnings about the dangers of nihilism. This is the story of a man who stood at the edge of the abyss and dared to look inside. And what he found changed the world forever. Imagine waking up one day and realizing that everything you once believed in, every value, every moral principle, every tradition, is nothing more than a human invention, a fabrication, an illusion. For Nietzsche, this wasn't just a philosophical theory, it was a terrifying reality. He saw the world around him crumbling under the weight of outdated beliefs. Christianity, in his view, had become a doctrine of weakness, a system designed to suppress human potential rather than elevate it. Inspired by Arthur Schopenhauer, who argued that life was nothing but endless suffering, Nietzsche took that idea even further. He saw that if God no longer played a role in human existence, then the entire moral and philosophical structure of the West was at risk of collapse. But here was the problem. If there is no God, no objective morality, and no eternal purpose, what remains? The answer? Nothing. This is what Nietzsche called the most dangerous force in human existence: nihilism. The realization that life has no inherent meaning, that the universe is indifferent, and that everything we do will eventually be forgotten. He saw nihilism as a disease, something that had the potential to consume entire civilizations. The Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky, who wrestled with similar existential fears, explored this theme in his novels, particularly The Brothers Karamazov, where he famously warned, "If God does not exist, everything is permitted." This echoed Nietzsche's fears. Without a higher purpose, would society descend into chaos, moral decay, and despair? But Nietzsche was not content with surrendering to nihilism. He saw it as a void that needed to be overcome. The question was, how? Nietzsche refused to accept nihilism as the final destination. If life had no inherent meaning, then the solution was clear. We must create our own. But how? How does one build meaning from nothing? To answer this, Nietzsche introduced one of his most famous and misunderstood concepts, the Übermensch. The Übermensch, Overman or Superman, was Nietzsche's vision of the next stage in human evolution, a being who had transcended the old values, who did not rely on external validation, and who imposed his own meaning upon the world. He envisioned a humanity that no longer needed the crutch of religion or conventional morality to define its purpose. Instead of passively accepting meaning from society, the Übermensch actively created it. This idea had profound consequences. It laid the groundwork for existentialist thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre, who argued that existence precedes essence, that we are born without purpose and must define ourselves. It also influenced Martin Heidegger, who explored how humans live in a state of anxiety when confronted with the responsibility of shaping their own destiny. For Nietzsche, meaning was not something to be discovered. It was something to be forged through action, struggle, and self-overcoming. Unlike Immanuel Kant, who sought moral laws that were universal, Nietzsche believed that each individual had to create their own path, their own morality, their own purpose. But how does one achieve this? Nietzsche saw struggle as the key, as hardship, pain, and conflict were not things to be avoided. They were necessary for growth. In his book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he writes, "What is great in man is that he is a bridge and not a goal. We are not meant to seek comfort or final answers, but to constantly push beyond our limits, to transform ourselves, to become something greater than what we are today. However, Nietzsche knew that this path was not for everyone. Most people, he argued, would rather live in herd mentality, following rules, traditions, and societal expectations instead of embracing the terrifying freedom of self-creation. Søren Kierkegaard, another great existentialist thinker, similarly warned that most people flee from true freedom because it brings anxiety and responsibility. But Nietzsche saw no other way forward. If humanity wanted to escape nihilism, it had to embrace the challenge of creating meaning from within. But this path came at a cost that Nietzsche himself would pay. Nietzsche's philosophy was not just a set of ideas, it was a personal war, a war against illusions, against societal norms, and ultimately against himself. And this war came at an immense cost. As he developed his radical ideas, Nietzsche became increasingly isolated. His philosophy rejected the values that governed society, which made him an outcast. He had once admired Richard Wagner, the great composer, seeing him as an embodiment of artistic genius. But when Wagner aligned himself with Christianity and nationalism, Nietzsche felt betrayed. He broke ties with his former mentor and criticized him in his book, The Case of Wagner. His relationships with friends and intellectuals crumbled. Even his mentor, Arthur Schopenhauer, had warned that true philosophers must be prepared to walk a lonely road. Nietzsche took this to an extreme. By the end of his life, he had no close companions, no home, and no stability. But it wasn't just social isolation that plagued him. His physical health deteriorated rapidly. Nietzsche suffered from intense migraines, vision problems, and mysterious neurological symptoms that worsened over time. Some historians believe he may have had a degenerative brain disease, while others suspect he suffered from the long-term effects of syphilis. Then, in January 1889, Nietzsche suffered a complete mental breakdown. The moment is infamous. In the streets of Turin, Italy, Nietzsche witnessed a horse being mercilessly whipped by its owner. Overcome with emotion, he ran to the animal, threw his arms around its neck, and collapsed, weeping uncontrollably. It was as if, in that instant, Nietzsche saw all the cruelty, suffering, and meaningless brutality of existence concentrated in a single act. After that, he was never the same. He spent the final 11 years of his life in near total insanity, unable to recognize his own writings, dependent on the care of his mother and sister. The irony is chilling. The man who preached strength, self-overcoming, and the creation of new values succumbed to his own fragility. His critics saw this as proof that his philosophy was flawed, that he was a madman, broken by his own contradictions. But others, including Carl Jung, believed Nietzsche had confronted truth so profound that they shattered his psyche. Jung even suggested that Nietzsche had descended into what he called psychic inflation, a state where one identifies too strongly with divine or godlike power, losing all connection to reality. Was Nietzsche a victim of his own genius? Did he push too far into the abyss? Or was he simply the first to bear the cost of the truths that would define modern existential thought? Regardless of the answer, one thing is certain: his ideas did not die with him. They would go on to inspire generations of thinkers, artists, and revolutionaries. But what, ultimately, was Nietzsche trying to teach us? Nietzsche did not want people to fall into nihilism. He did not want humanity to be consumed by despair. On the contrary, he wanted us to rise above it. He wanted us to see that meaning is not something we are given. It is something we must create. That instead of relying on old beliefs and external structures, we must forge our own path, embrace our own struggles, and take full responsibility for our existence. His ideas would later be embraced and reinterpreted by some of the most important thinkers of the 20th century. Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus took Nietzsche's insights into the absurdity of life and turned them into existentialism, arguing that, even in a meaningless world, we are free to create our own purpose. Camus, in particular, believed that instead of succumbing to despair, we should rebel against the void, a concept strikingly similar to Nietzsche's own philosophy. Nietzsche's influence also extended beyond philosophy. Sigmund Freud saw his work as a precursor to psychoanalysis, particularly in the idea that humans are driven by unconscious forces of power and desire. Even in literature, figures like Franz Kafka and James Joyce built upon his themes of alienation, struggle, and the search for meaning in a chaotic world. But the question remains, are we strong enough to embrace Nietzsche's challenge? If there is no God to define our purpose, if there is no absolute morality to guide us, if there is no cosmic meaning waiting to be discovered, then do we have the courage to create our own? Nietzsche believed that those who could rise above nihilism, who could impose their own values upon existence, would become Übermenschen, individuals who live authentically, who embrace life in all its pain and beauty, who refuse to be victims of fate or society. But this path is not easy. Most people, he warned, would rather remain in the herd, clinging to comforting illusions rather than facing the terrifying freedom of true self-determination. So the final question Nietzsche leaves us with is this: will you choose comfort or will you choose power? Because in the end, life will not give you meaning. You must give meaning to life.